So in this segment, we're going to be discussing Rory Stewart debates with Caroline Lucas over Scottish independence. I'm glad Caroline Lucas has been given kind of time to talk on this, but again, I think it should be more kind of, well, I'd say more kind of Scottish members talking about this kind of stuff, but shouldn't really gatekeep independence.
Nobody
or independent conversations, in my opinion,
is thinking, as far as I'm aware, of what might happen in England if Scotland achieves its independence, if Ireland goes its own way, and therefore we
it's very likely. She's talking about Irish unification. I think that's far more likely to happen than Scottish independence, and I think Irish unification will happen a lot quicker than Scottish independence as well, because Irish unification is out of the hands of the British government. The only thing that we have to do is the border poll, which the Tories are being iffy on, but the Americans can put pressure on that end, whereas Scotland doesn't really have access to that kind of agreement.
Ought to start having a conversation, I think, about what is our view of this union of nations and how do we make it work as well as we can for all of its component parts.
Karen, I guess that sort of maybe exposed one of the challenges, which is that under the surface of what you're saying is a story which not everybody in the progressive central left would buy into. It sounds as though you are quite pro-Scottish independence. I mean, the way in which you've characterised what I, as a unionist, would characterise as we had a referendum very recently, people voted to stay.
And this is where it does get a bit ironic when you've got people like Rory Stewart who want us to go back into the EU, despite the fact that we had a referendum on that as well, which was after the Scottish independence referendum. And the Scottish independence referendum, a lot of the arguments were based on if Scotland leaves the Union, it won't be a part of the EU. There's been a lot of change since that referendum has happened. So his argument really doesn't make sense given what we know about Rory Stewart's other ideals.
There isn't evidence that there's an overwhelming majority for independence, and we're not going to have another referendum in another generation, would be the normal position for me and many people in the Labour.
So we shouldn't have another referendum on EU membership for another generation then, based on your logic?
Labour Party. You almost talk as though you're sort of slightly looking forward to a day when Scotland achieves its independence. I mean, even that language
feels like a personal attack here.
It hints to me that you're somebody who actually isn't very comfortable with the idea of the United Kingdom.
No, I don't think that's true, although you rightly take me up on that verb, which I shall consider. But what I do think is that it should be up to Scotland. I think Scotland should decide whether or not it wants to remain part of the UK.
Scotland did decide,
yes,
Caroline, and we decided we'd do it once in a generation. I mean,
we didn't decide it would be once in a generation. No one said that. I think Salmon said it's a once in a generation vote or once in a lifetime vote, but no one else. When they did the referendum, there was no, oh yeah, guys, we're going to run it back in 20 odd years' time. That didn't happen.
The Canadian situation, where you have a referendum every 3-4 years whenever the SNP wants to have a political event.
But work that out within Scotland. Don't come running to a government in Westminster to say whether or not you can do that. If there isn't a support for that within Scotland, then I'm sure that the party who is proposing that won't do so well and won't have the right and the power to introduce it. But what I'm objecting to is one component part of the United.
The only argument I'd make is if Scotland aren't pro-independence, why do they keep voting for pro-Indy parties? Why is it that the pro-Indy parties have a majority in Holyrood despite the system not favouring majorities? Why is that? That's the argument I think she should be making.
The kingdom having a veto on whether another component part has the right to have a referendum on whether or not to leave.
But this isn't abnormal, right? This is what Spain would do with Catalonia. This is what the United States...
That doesn't make it right, though. That doesn't make it right just because other countries do it. Doesn't make it justified.
It would do with Texas. I mean...
And they can vote to secede from the Union, I believe. The states in the USA can secede. Like, I don't think there'll be I don't think there's much the federal government can do about it.
Nations are complicated things, and we went through this with Canada and Quebec. It's not a simple question of here's a component part of the country, and it can continually create this deeply destabilizing moves again and again, and also that the rest of the country doesn't have a say. I mean, I don't think...
Why should the rest of the country have a say if one part wants to leave? That doesn't make any sense.
It is only for Scotland, the question of Scottish independence. I think that's one of the things that makes the United Kingdom different. And this is where I think this question of stories becomes quite complicated, and where I think Alistair's right to say you defining England as separate from Scotland is
it is different, though. These are two different nations. Like, it is separate from Scotland. These are two different nations. what one is effective, one effectively can govern over the other one. I know there is devolution, but the English Parliament, the Westminster Parliament, can get rid of the Scottish Act if it wants to. The one that gives it the devolved powers. We can get rid of that at any point. Like this argument of these two things are not separate. They are separate.
Problematic, because I would argue that actually the rest of the country does have some sort of interest in the question of how nations relate to
It has an interest, yeah. Should it have a say over it? No, it shouldn't. It should be up to them.
each other. It isn't purely for Scotland.
I guess I would just say that I think the relationship between Texas and Washington is not the same as it is between the four nations that make up the United Kingdom.
I don't know. Was Texas really an independent state for that long compared to Scotland, which was an independent state for a long time? It doesn't really make any sense to use the Texas argument. The Catalonia argument maybe makes more sense. The Basque region makes more sense. But these are regions that do want independence. It's just their national government are stopping them from doing so. That's the difference. But clearly, it's national self-determination for other countries, but not for members of the Union. That's the problem they're going to run into. We've seen that with Eastern Bloc countries. Many of them separate into smaller and smaller countries. And I think they're happier having it that way, of being able to govern themselves, rather than being part of unions that might have made them richer, but came with other problems. We've seen that with, I think, Czechoslovakia when they split. They split into 3 component parts. And I think they are happier for it. And that, I think that goes across a lot of the Eastern Bloc countries. They could have been together and a much more powerful union, but they decided to split for various different reasons. The idea that England and Scotland are joint or, can't be separated out doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense. And this is the unionist argument. Well, if it's the case that that's the case, Scotland and England are kind of joint or whatever, shouldn't they have more of a say of the way things are governed? Because right now they don't, because England dominates the Parliament. That's the problem. We can make decisions that go way against Scotland. We can get rid of their devolved powers if we want to. A government come in and say, nope, no more devolution for you. You're going to listen to us from now on. And all the good positive changes you made, like having cleaner water, having free prescriptions, we're going to get rid of that. That can happen at any moment. So this whole argument, it makes no sense. It's very patriarchal, I guess. That was the argument I would use. Very much, we're looking after your best interests. You just don't get it. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.